I'm just gonna say it. Rosa's placement in this series feels like a very tactical move on Chibnall's part, and whilst I don't want to disregard the good intentions that I hope fueled this episode's creation, taking our new multiracial TARDIS team back to 1950s Alabama is certainly a striking choice, one undoubtedly set to make multiple headlines and continue shaping the identity that this new era wants to present. To be clear, I don't object to the idea of this episode. In fact, I think it could be genuinely stirring and thought-provoking if handled well. Yet in its attempt to tell this tale that has one foot in real history and another in timey-wimey fiction, Rosa manages to accidentally imply some pretty daunting things. I realise this is an episode that some people love, even hail as one of the best of the entire show.
My favourite episode of the series.
Yeah?
Possibly of the new series.
Really?
Up there with some of my favourite classic episodes as well.
Wow, my god!
And whilst I can appreciate its intentions, for me Rosa sadly stumbles in execution. The premise is this: in trying to get our companions home, the Doctor accidentally lands in Alabama, 1955. She detects a trace of Artron energy, and so her and the fam decide to investigate it. They soon bump into none other than Rosa Parks, who shows traces of the same Artron energy, and from that they discover that they're not the only visitors from the future. Except this visitor has a malicious intent to change history completely. So, viewing Rosa as simply a piece of sci-fi television, it's mediocre at best. There's definitely improvements here over the Ghost Monuments. It's far better paced, has generally better dialogue, and is decently structured. Small touches like an otherwise generic Elvis joke, getting a nice payoff later, make this feel a little more thought out.
You haven't got Elvis's phone number.
Don't ever tell anyone I lent him a mobile phone. Front row tickets to see Frank Sinatra and a VIP pass to meet Frank himself. Good job Elvis lent Frank that mobile phone against everything I told him.
I'll even credit some scenes as being pretty great, like the moment where Ryan and Graham taunt James Blake at the fishing spot.
Oi, oi, Jim boy.
The music is also decent. Krasko's theme isn't anything particularly special, just some low strings, but hey, I at least remember it. Jodie also gets one of her most doctory lines yet, delivered with just the right amount of snark.
I'm not armed.
They're supposed to make me not shoot you.
Ideally.
Unfortunately, this episode doesn't completely escape the typical pitfalls of this era so far. Poor direction is abundant in this episode, often failing to properly communicate what's actually happening. I already covered the suitcase scene in an earlier video, in which Krasko seems to magically appear behind the Doctor, who just instinctively throws the suitcase behind her. But another scene that suffers is the cafe sequence, which involves our characters slowly realizing that everyone in the room is staring at them, with the intention to kick them out. If you look in the background, it seems like they're trying to have people glancing and staring at them, but not only are they ridiculously out of focus, but it's so poorly coordinated with the dialogue that we keep cutting away from them anytime they're about to stare. It's like they just told the extras to glance randomly at the cast and didn't question whether it would line up in the edit. As the scene progresses, Graham starts looking around, but even he's halfway out of the shot and drifting out of focus. So only when we start cutting away to staff does it become clear what's actually happening. This is what happens when you shoot all your dialogue in select focus close-ups. Also, if this is a segregated establishment, then why did no one say anything when they first entered? Did it really take everyone a solid few minutes to notice them sitting there? If we compare it to a similar scene from Deep Breath, this actually lets us see the room, with a nice wide shot framing our characters amidst the other diners. Cutaways are used to show our characters observing the room, rather than being thrown in there at random, and close-ups are only used when appropriate, such as when our characters start to whisper. We also get a shot from behind that uses a rack focus to show the slow shift of our characters' attention. Also, note how they're sat in a booth, so this shot would have to be specifically planned and set up to be filmed this way. This shows an extra level of thought that feels missing from Rosa's point-and-shoot style. Also, much like the Ghost Monument, I can't help but feel our characters are a little too blasé in this situation. Whilst I can at least appreciate Ryan's response being a reference.
Good, because I don't eat them.
Yaz's
She talking to me?
just feels too quippy. And after all that, Ryan and Yaz seem completely unfazed.
I'm cool with it. What do you reckon, Mexican lady?
Keep that up, I'll use you as a piñata.
Another thing we start to see a lot of are these weird superhero shots where everyone stands in an unnatural formation.
Getting pretty sick of seeing that sign.
Also, I'm pretty sure that's the first time we've actually seen that sign. Now, whilst it's better, dialogue is still pretty hit and miss in general this episode. Certain lines and exchanges feel really clumsy or overwritten.
I understand weapon, but not sure about temporal displacement.
Why would anybody do that to a suitcase? Any clues what any of that is? The driver let me on at the front of the bus. What does that mean for where I sit? Obviously not a lot of Pakistani heritage around here. Does colour just mean black in 1955? Guess I'll pack my South Asian Mexican backside in the white section then and let's see what happens. Riding the bus in Montgomery. Good times.
Sometimes it's as if an entire exchange has been hastily dubbed onto the start of a scene.
Do you hear that? Everything we do, Krasko's a step ahead. He must have deliberately smashed up that bus himself.
We've got to fix this. James Blake has got to drive Rosa's bus home tonight.
Perfect. We can wait here, then get on the bus with her when she finishes work. Have a little chat.
Nicking and hot wiring a bus from right outside the depot. Hope our friendly cop don't hear about this.
And on other occasions, entire events happen completely off-screen. There's our usual clunky comedic timing.
Did you just accidentally pay me a compliment?
Whatever.
We get more irritating, overly peppy exposition and technobabble from the Doctor.
That, plus his vortex manipulator, were presumably what the TARDIS detected when it brought us here, registering traces of Artron energy all around her. Why is that?
Though she does have some better moments. Overall, it's not much better on a technical level than what we've had so far, but it does at least have a little more to offer in terms of humour and pace. However, I do feel like the plotting can get a little contrived at times. There's a part where 13 Sonic detects something about Krasko, but rather than revealing what that is, it's used as an excuse for her to go back.
Besides, the Sonic picked up something else on him, but I need to go back to make sure.
She also decides to stash everyone at a whites-only motel rather than the TARDIS, because they might run into Krasko and she doesn't want to do that yet.
We go in and out of there, we're going to run into him again, and I don't want to just yet.
I mean, I understand he has a temporal displacement weapon, but the next scene with Krasko shows just how easily it overheats. I mean, is it really safer to be at this motel? And whilst there's some charm to the characters gathering information through pamphlets and newspapers, surely the TARDIS would contain all the information they need anyway. I mean, they're watching a video of Rosa Parks getting the Nobel Peace Prize at the end, unless that's meant to be like a live feed. What is that? You might say, because then there wouldn't be an episode, but gathering the information is handled in a roughly 20-second montage. So essentially the only reason they're at the motel is to have a scene where our characters are menaced by a racist police officer. To be fair, I do like aspects of this scene. The Doctor talks to the officer in a way that's completely honest, whilst also keeping Ryan and Yaz hidden.
We're not harbouring anyone who doesn't have a right to be here. I don't recognise anyone by that description.
Also, the way the officer talks about Ryan does show how stories can be distorted and used to demonize other races.
See, the Negro's been going around picking fights with upstanding citizens.
There's some nice stuff here, but its inclusion in the episode is pretty contrived. Nothing from this scene really sets anything up for later, and whilst it creates a little tension, it's effectively all lost when we see Ryan and Yaz just casually chatting about the topic of the week. The way racism in general is presented in this episode feels pretty one-dimensional. There's a sort of theatrical Hollywood quality to it, where everything is dramatic and pumped up, but it mostly seems to be white people angry that other races are near them. I mean, sure, that's one way of displaying racism, but it comes in many forms. Showing more normal, even pleasant people, yet with prejudice views, would show just how ingrained into society racism was. Perhaps you could even explore some of the systemic racism that preserved such racial inequality. I'm reminded of a subplot from the show Sex Education, one that deals with sexual assault. The character of Amy is just taking her bus to school when she notices a man sexually harassing her. Compared to the slap scene in Rosa, it's incredibly downplayed.
Hey, get your filthy black hands off my wife!
Stop! Sir, please!
What are you doing? He's whacking on me!
There's a little bit of audio manipulation here.
Yeah, I just need to get off the bus, please.
But the scene doesn't try to tell you how to feel. Much like Amy, you're more weirded out than disturbed.
I'm fine, honestly.
However, the show focuses on Amy and shows how this event permeates her mind, the reality of what happened hitting her later.
Ames, why are you crying?
Because I can't get on the bus.
The focus is on her experience and how this affected her, not the event itself. In Rosa's case, Ryan's experience of physical assault is largely forgotten about once it's over.
He had this really kind face, and he didn't look like some wanking psycho killer. So it's like, if he could do something like that, then anyone could.
He'll be swinging from a tree with the noose for a neckerchief if he touches a white woman in Montgomery.
For an episode about Rosa and the civil rights movement, it doesn't seem to be particularly concerned with exploring these people or giving them a voice. So, let's address the elephant in the room. Krasko sucks. His inclusion in the episode causes so much collateral damage to not only the plot, but also the episode's entire purpose. As a character, he's utterly dull and one-dimensional. Now, I can understand that Krasko is, in a way, an embodiment of racism.
He's a racist. That's kind of how this works.
And so, humanizing him or attempting to flesh out his motivations is a precarious ground to tread on. But unfortunately, the lack of any clear motivation opens up a whole host of worrying questions about this episode's premise. Krasko is essentially a future mass murderer who is sent to Stormcage containment facility. Here, he had a neural restrictor installed into his brain, which stops him from inflicting harm or killing any living thing. Quite an interesting little concept there. Now, based on the mention of Stormcage, we can assume his character is from at least the 52nd century. One comment from the Doctor suggests it could even be as far as the 79th century.
79th century, judging by the weapon setting.
So this guy is a mass murderer from between 3,000 to over 5,000 years into the future, and his goal is to travel several thousand years into the past to stop Rosa Parks from sitting on a bus because that's where things started to go wrong.
This is where things started to go wrong.
Okay, so you're telling me this guy was so angry at the existence of other races that he managed to whittle down all of humanity's potential progress towards racial tolerance across thousands of years to one person in one event, on one day, in one city, in one country, in 1 year, and figured that changing that will therefore alter the entire future of racial equality. Now, think about what civilization was like 3,000 years ago, and what it could possibly be like 3,000 years from now. Krasko's motivation is like the equivalent of me travelling back to try and stop the Beakerfolk.
Bloody Beakerfolk!
And before we start claiming about fixed points and butterfly effects, well, America isn't the only country in the world. The American civil rights movement isn't the only racial struggle that's ever happened. Hell, the Montgomery bus boycott wasn't even the only bus boycott in America. What this episode implies is that if this one supposed fluke incident didn't happen, humanity would have never progressed in the next 3,000 plus years.
Parks won't be asked to stand, she won't protest, and your kind won't get above themselves.
And maybe if this was something just Krasko believed, I could accept it as an example of his deluded thinking. But no, every character treats it as the definitive outcome of his actions. The episode earnestly promotes the idea that, had Rosa not sat on that bus, Krasko would have won and the future is changed. It's never even questioned.
And all this basically kicked off the US civil rights movement led by Martin Luther King.
We're one day out of a tipping point in Earth history. I don't want anything disrupting that. He's planning to nudge it, just enough so that it doesn't happen.
And don't you think that kind of spits in the face of all the other protests and civil rights activists fighting across America at the time? Hell, fighting across the entire world? Rosa Parks wasn't even the first woman to be arrested when defending her right to remain seated. Claudette Colvin faced the exact same thing several months earlier, and the popularity of her case means that it could have been chosen to protest segregation on buses. But ultimately she was considered a less sympathetic figure than Parks. Does your episode really work as a piece of informative and educational content if the history you're teaching people is blatantly misrepresented? To be clear, the episode never explicitly states that the Doctor believes in Krasko's version of the future, but it's also never stated that she doesn't. Sometimes the episode seemingly frames the Doctor's actions as merely preserving history.
Well, he didn't reckon with us keeping it in place. Keep history in order.
But other times they draw attention to how Rosa Parks changed the world.
And Rosa Parks changed the world?
But she changed the world. We're one day out of a tipping point in Earth history.
In the end, the episode's stakes are just really poorly defined. Not to mention, if she is preserving history, then this itself opens up a whole host of worrying questions. Imagine for a moment that this didn't take place in our history, and was instead a far distant alien planet. It would probably feel quite uncomfortable to see the Doctor so complicit in the discrimination of others. You'd ideally want her to fight there and then to change things now, because that is those people's presence. But in the case of Rosa, it's of course dealing with actual history and actual people. You can't just rewrite what happened because that disrespects those who experienced it. At the same time, attempting to preserve our past implies that that's the most ideal course that history could have taken. But this isn't Waters of Mars, where the writers have conceived a perfect domino effect of events. It's real history. Overall, these are just the kind of issues you get from tackling a moment as sensitive as this. Even with your best intentions, without a lot of careful consideration, you're very likely to accidentally imply some pretty troubling stuff. It's for this reason that I really struggle to appreciate Rosa as much as others. Sure, to tackle this topic at all might be stunning and brave, but when you have to contrive actual history in order to tell this underwhelming sci-fi story, it reflects badly on your intentions for tackling this topic at all, and it therefore makes your attempts at social commentary appear even more hollow and surface level. This story doesn't feel like an earnest attempt to convey the struggle of Rosa Parks, and rather like they're merely using this event to mine shock and guilt from its audience. With the focus on tiny actions changing the world, there does seem to be some kind of potential theme.
Tiny actions change the world. History changes when tiny things don't go to plan.
Tiny actions. That's what Krasko's doing.
Possibly encouraging people to try and make a difference in small ways. But if we try to apply this statement to the Rosa Parks incident, well, it begins to undermine the truth of the event. Refusing to give it your seat might seem like a tiny action, but in the case of Rosa, it was anything but. The effort these people put into fighting for civil rights was by no means tiny, and to imply it was all down to a fluke on a bus borders on disrespectful. What's interesting is that the episode almost draws attention to Rosa being an activist, and yet proceeds with a plot that frames this as the be-all end-all of the civil rights movement. To be clear, it's not that Doctor Who shouldn't play with history. We've had witches in Shakespeare, alien creatures in Van Gogh paintings, and even the Doctor starting the Great Fire of London. But there's a difference in subject matter here. Shakespeare and the Great Fire are from hundreds of years ago and have been sanitized by time. Rosa takes place 66 years ago and deals with issues that are still hotly discussed today. Whilst Vincent van Gogh is slightly more recent, the episode succeeds in creating an incredibly compelling character, with a thoughtful exploration of his life and battle with depression. Rosa Parks in this episode is not a particularly engaging character, and I don't feel like I grow to know or become invested in her. She feels more like a kind and stoic historical caricature than an actual living person, and this isn't helped by the way our characters gush over her.
No way.
You're kidding.
Brilliant. Lovely to meet you, Rosa Parks. Big fan.
She refused to give up a seat on a segregated bus to a white passenger. Her arrest started a boycott of the buses in Montgomery.
People like Rosa Parks fought those battles for me.
Thank you. From me and my nan.
I'd rather connect with Rosa Parks as a human being and understand her struggle than have the fam simply talk about how important she is. Hell, we even get a Martin Luther King impersonator turn up, and he gets literally nothing to do.
I'm sorry for your loss, son. Thank you. Thank you, Martin Luther King.
We don't even get a glimpse at what these activists might have talked about. Instead, Ryan just gushes over the historical figures, with basically no emphasis on her work or campaigning.
Excuse me, Dr. King. Yes, Rosa Parks?
Also, every black character with dialogue in the story is currently standing in this room. These feel less like real people and more like talking museum exhibits. Essentially, the rest of the episode is a runaround, trying to undo Krasko's actions whilst he's one step ahead of them. So anyway, the Doctor obtains a bus through the power of ADR and sets James Blake on his normal route, and boy does that make Krasko angry. He attempts to block the road with a car, which leads to a confrontation with Ryan. So then Ryan just shoots him back in time, and that's it. He's just gone now. That was the end of the villain.
Nice one, Ryan. Thanks, Ryan.
Okay.
Hey, what was that thing last episode about guns, never use them?
So Ryan joins our other characters on the bus. Something this episode does that gives me huge anxiety is that characters will just stand around and talk in front of everyone, even though they're meant to be getting on or off buses. Like, stop wasting people's time. Everyone's just looking at you. What are you talking about, Ryan? And so, as they approach the fateful stop, the Doctor suddenly realizes something. If they leave the bus now, there won't be enough full seats to force black passengers to stand. This all culminates in a very questionable climax. Sure, you have Rosa's defiance and brave decision to stay seated, but it feels like her struggle isn't the focus here. Rather, the scene arguably places more emphasis on the guilt of our characters for having to let this happen. Wow, how terrible that our morally right protagonists have to take part in this awful system to protect the future. It honestly feels uncomfortable for them to have been so complicit throughout the episode, and then right at the end, their tragedy seemingly trumps that of Rosa's. Heck, I find it uncomfortable just how much they're stalking Rosa throughout the episode. If I was her, I'd feel really freaked out that these people kept popping up in my life. Not to mention, the episode only reinforces the idea of this whole incident being a fluke. Like, first it was undone by Krasko, and then it was recreated by the Doctor. Rosa feels like she had no agency in this situation. And then, to top it all off, a goddamn pop ballad rolls in.
You're broken down and tired.
Look, I realise this song was representing the Black Lives Matter movement, but it feels so tone-deaf and out of place within the 50s setting and Rosa's struggle. At best, it's a superficial attempt to link it to contemporary issues, and if hearing it once wasn't enough, they then play it again over the credits.
And we'll rise up.
They should have played Strange Fruit. And so, with the deed done, our characters all return to the TARDIS. We get easily the most patronising what did we learn moment of the series so far, in which everyone stands around unnaturally and watches a YouTube video of Rosa.
On the 21st of December 1956, segregation on buses in Montgomery was ended.
And then the point that the episode ends on is the fact that Rosa got an asteroid named after her.
Also known as Rosa Parks.
She changed the universe.
She changed the universe.
Really? Because because she's now got a piece of rock named after her. No time is given for the characters to actually reflect or to talk about what they went through and what they did, which only serves to make them feel even more like blank slates. Now, as a first introduction to Rosa Parks, I can cut this episode a little slack. I first learned about Rosa Parks and the civil rights movement at school, so it shocked me to hear that people hadn't been taught it. The episode works as a simplified insight into the event and key figures, but I wouldn't say it presents anything much more complex than that. I want to assume the best intentions of those who conceived this story, but it feels very emblematic of this era's approach to social issues, often presenting a very simplified and occasionally misjudged morality. In the end, Rosa played it safe, gave us a pretty average sci-fi story, and may have sparked some conversations. Whilst the number of 1-star reviews on IMDb is ridiculous, the number of 10-star reviews is almost double that. This is by no means the worst episode ever, but it's nothing particularly special. Despite its somewhat controversial premise, Rosa did have the potential to be something genuinely great. A chance to shed light on the efforts of the civil rights movement and the hard work of an important figure, to invest us in the struggles of those of the past. Yet, whether viewed as just a sci-fi adventure or a genuine attempt to portray history, Rosa just doesn't quite manage to satisfy either. Despite its better pace, the script contains many of the same pitfalls we've seen so far, and although it has the outward appearance of a stirring look at our recent past, the episode's premise requires a distorted version of real events. Unfortunately, Rosa is seemingly so concerned with shocking its audience through displays of racism that it forgets to give its central character an actual voice. Not to mention, it's incredibly mean-spirited, presenting a really pessimistic look at our future.
And in 53 years, I'll have a black president as leader. Who knows where they'll be 50 years after that?
I mean, judging by Krasko, likely not very far. So, with the potential to travel literally anywhere in space and time, what exciting premise might our planks of wood find themselves in next?
But we agreed. Okay, get in.
Cheddar, 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 cheddar.